At midnight, Emily wakes up unable to move, skin glued to sandpaper sheets. Bare feet slap the parquet, step by step, perfectly calm. Moonlight hits the wardrobe mirror. And it shows her face standing over the bed, breathing deep, while something rotten in the mattress breathes for her. September 19th, 2025, arrived with a heavy, bruised sky that seemed to press down on the quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge. Emily stood before the towering silhouette of number 42, her fingers trembling slightly as they gripped the strap of her worn leather satchel. The house loomed like a somber monument to a forgotten era, its Victorian gables casting jagged shadows across the overgrown, choked lawn. When she finally turned the heavy brass handle, the massive oak door swung open with a groan of neglected hinges, only to shut behind her with a dull, wet thud. It was a sound of absolute finality, reminiscent of a predator's jaw snapping shut on its prey, sealing the world of sunlight and distant traffic noise away from her. Inside the foyer, the air hung thick and motionless, as if the oxygen itself had been trapped there for decades. It carried a cloying, medicinal weight, a sharp tang of petroleum jelly and menthol mingled with the dust of crumbling ledgers and the faint, sickly sweetness of lilies rotting in stagnant vase water. Emily took a shallow breath, feeling the grime of the atmosphere coat the back of her throat like a thin film of oil. The dim light filtering through the stained glass transom window did little to illuminate the space, instead casting bruised shades of violet and deep ochre across the peeling, water-stained wallpaper. For a struggling medical student whose bank account had dwindled to single digits, this live-in position at the Blackwood estate was supposed to be a providential escape from the brink of eviction. Emily adjusted the collar of her blouse, trying to swallow the lump of apprehension that had settled in her chest since she first signed the contract with the distant, clinical law firm. She reminded herself of the sterile logic of her textbooks, attempting to replace her rising unease with the professional detachment of a caregiver. Yet, as she stared down the long, cavernous hallway that stretched into the bowels of the house, the building seemed to breathe with a slow, rhythmic pulse that defied any rational explanation. Her footsteps echoed with a startling, abrasive clarity as she began her walk toward the rear of the house. Each weathered floorboard beneath her feet screamed under the pressure, emitting a long, dry crack that sounded like frozen branches breaking in a winter forest. The sound was brittle and agonizingly slow, vibrating through the thin soles of her shoes and up her spine. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched her progress from the shadows, their painted eyes seemingly tracking her movement through the gloom. The further she ventured, the colder the air became, stripping away the warmth of the late summer afternoon and replacing it with a damp, subterranean chill. At the very end of the corridor, a single door stood slightly ajar, revealing a thin sliver of the room beyond. A pale, monochromatic light spilled out into the hallway, a ghostly gray that suggested the sun had never truly reached this part of the world. Emily pushed the door open, the sound of the heavy wood dragging against the thick, moth-eaten carpet being the only thing breaking the oppressive silence. In the center of the vast, shadow-drenched chamber sat a high, iron-framed bed that looked more like an altar than a piece of furniture. It was draped in layers of heavy, colorless linen that seemed to swallow what little light managed to penetrate the grime-streaked windows. Upon the bed lay the hollowed-out remains of Mrs. Blackwood, a figure so motionless she appeared to be carved from ancient, yellowed ivory. Her body was a withered cocoon, a fragile scaffolding of bone over which a layer of translucent, parchment-like skin had been stretched to the point of tearing. There was no rise and fall of a chest, no twitch of a finger, only a stillness so absolute it bordered on the supernatural. She was a relic of a life long since departed, a husk kept from total decay by some unseen, stubborn force of will that permeated the very fabric of the room. The smell here was different, stronger, more concentrated, smelling of old paper, antiseptic, and the cold scent of a cellar. Suddenly, the silence was pierced by a faint, wet rustle, a sound like silk sliding over a damp surface. The woman's head did not move, but her eyes, enormous, unnaturally vibrant amber orbs, snapped toward Emily with a predatory, terrifying precision. They were wide and glassy, shimmering with a hidden intelligence that felt entirely too heavy, too vital for such a frail, shattered vessel. As those golden eyes locked onto hers, Emily felt a sudden, sharp prickle of ice along the nape of her neck. The gaze was not one of a patient seeking comfort or a soul in pain, but of a hungry observer marking a long-awaited arrival, calculating the worth of the youth standing before her. The 20th and 21st of September bled into one another, dissolving the boundaries of time until the world outside the heavy oak doors of the Blackwood estate ceased to exist. Emily found her life measured no longer by hours, but by a relentless, rhythmic sequence of sounds that defined the suffocating silence of the house. In the kitchen, the faulty brass faucet in the sink emitted a steady, percussive drip that echoed against the stained porcelain like a metronome in an empty cathedral. Each bead of water took precisely 4 seconds to form, hanging heavy and swollen before plunging into the basin with a wet, hollow metallic ring. It was a sound that seemed to drill into Emily's skull, a constant reminder of the slow, inevitable erosion of the world around her, while she waited for the kettle to begin its low, thrumming vibration on the ancient gas stove. The air in the kitchen always felt 5 degrees colder than the rest of the house, smelling of damp stone and the bitter, sharp scent of dried tea leaves that had sat in their canisters for a decade. Emily watched the blue flames of the burner as they licked the underside of the kettle, the sound of the gas hissing like a nest of disturbed vipers. When the water finally reached its boiling point, the whistle did not scream, it issued a thin, mournful wail that sounded like a distant human voice crying out in a fog. She would grip the handle of the tray, her knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white, and prepare herself for the journey down the long, shadowed corridor that led to the heart of the house. The hallway remained a gauntlet of groaning wood and shifting shadows, where the air was perpetually thick with the scent of lavender-scented floor wax and something far more ancient, the smell of deep, undisturbed dust and the faint, sweet rot of old timber. Each of Emily's steps produced a dry, splintering crack beneath the threadbare Persian rug, a sound that reminded her of the snapping of bird bones. The walls, draped in wallpaper that depicted intricate, tangled vines, seemed to lean inward as she passed, the patterns twisting in the corners of her vision like restless insects. She kept her gaze fixed on the sliver of gray light at the end of the passage, her heart thumping a jagged, uneven rhythm against her ribs that she could feel in the very tips of her fingers. Entering Mrs. Blackwood's bedroom was like stepping into a pressurized chamber where the very atmosphere was saturated with the sound of the old woman's respiration. It was a heavy, labored sound, a wet, rattling intake of air followed by a long, whistling exhale that grated against the silence like sandpaper being dragged over dry, weathered wood. The sound was mechanical, devoid of any human rhythm, as if the lungs inside that withered chest were made of bellows and rusted iron. Emily would set the tray down on the nightstand, the clatter of the ceramic cup against the wood sounding like an explosion in the stillness, and she would feel the temperature in the room rise, becoming humid and cloying with the smell of antiseptic and warm, stagnant skin. During the long afternoon hours, Emily's duties required her to tend to the physical needs of the woman who was little more than a living statue. She would take a soft sponge, dipping it into a basin of lukewarm water that quickly turned a cloudy, milky gray, and gently press it against Mrs. Blackwood's arm. The skin was terrifyingly thin, a translucent membrane that felt like damp parchment or the shed skin of a snake, revealing the intricate, bruised network of purple veins beneath. As the damp sponge moved over the unmoving limbs, Emily could hear the faint, leathery friction of the skin, a sound that made the hair on her arms stand up in a wave of primal revulsion. Throughout the entire process, the woman remained a motionless weight, a heavy anchor of flesh and bone that seemed to be pulling the very bedsheets down into the floorboards. The only thing that moved in that room were the eyes, those enormous, amber spheres that hummed with an unnatural, terrifying vitality. They followed Emily with a predatory smoothness, never blinking, the irises shimmering like liquid gold in the dim light of the overcast afternoons. Emily felt the weight of that gaze as a physical pressure, a hot, itching sensation on her skin that made her want to scrub herself raw. There was no gratitude in those eyes, no flickering plea for relief from the prison of paralysis. Instead, they possessed a sharp, clinical intensity, as if they were dissecting Emily, peeling back her layers of muscle and bone to see the pulsing life beneath. The gaze was heavy and intelligent, radiating a cold, calculated hunger that felt entirely out of place in a body so near to the grave. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on the 24th of September, the room would dissolve into a sea of long, jagged shadows that stretched across the floor like skeletal fingers. Emily would move to the windows to pull the heavy, velvet curtains shut, the fabric letting out a dusty, muffled thud as it met the wooden frames. The sound of the world outside, the wind in the trees, the distant bark of a dog, was instantly severed, leaving her alone with the rhythmic rasp of the breathing on the bed. She would then turn to the corner of the room, near the towering mahogany wardrobe that smelled of mothballs and cedar, to begin her own nightly ritual of changing out of her uniform and into her sleeping clothes. The process of undressing in that room became a descent into a private, silent nightmare of sensory hyper-awareness. Emily would reach for the top button of her blouse, her fingers fumbling with the fabric, and the sound of the plastic button sliding through the thread was as loud as a gunshot in her ears. As she peeled the cotton away from her shoulders, the cool, stagnant air of the room hit her bare skin, sending a violent shiver through her frame. She could hear the rustle of her own clothes, a dry, shushing sound that seemed to be mimicked by the shadows in the corners. She kept her back to the bed, her eyes fixed on the dark, polished wood of the wardrobe, but she could feel the amber eyes boring into the space between her shoulder blades with the intensity of a branding iron. The silence in the room during these moments began to change. It was no longer a void, but a living, vibrating entity that hummed with a high-pitched, electric tension. Emily's breath hitched in her throat, her chest tightening until she could only take shallow, panicked sips of the thick air. She felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of heat radiating from the bed behind her, a wave of invisible energy that made the fine hairs on her neck bristle. It was the feeling of being watched not by a person, but by a creature crouched in the tall grass, its muscles coiled and its senses attuned to the slightest tremor of its prey. The very air seemed to thicken, becoming viscous and sweet, tasting of old copper and crushed flowers. Finally, unable to bear the pressure of the unseen gaze any longer, Emily would turn around, her heart hammering a frantic, suffocating beat against her sternum. In the guttering light of the single lamp on the nightstand, she saw Mrs. Blackwood's eyes wide and fixed, the amber irises glowing with a terrifying, feverish brilliance. There was no mistake now, the expression in those eyes was one of raw, naked lust, a deep and ancient craving that felt like a physical touch upon Emily's skin. It was a look of profound, covetous desire, as if the old woman were not just watching her, but tasting the youth and the strength that flowed through Emily's veins. The calculation in the gaze was terrifyingly clear. It was the look of a jeweler appraising a flawless diamond, or a butcher eyeing a prime cut of meat. Then, in the absolute center of the ringing silence, Emily heard a sound that made the blood freeze in her heart, a tiny, wet, anatomical click. It was the sound of Mrs. Blackwood's pupils dilating, expanding with a sudden, violent speed until the amber was nearly swallowed by twin abysses of black. The sound was so small, so intimate, that it implied the old woman was much closer than the bed allowed, as if her consciousness had reached out to press itself against Emily's own. The air in the room suddenly felt as though it were being sucked out through a vacuum, leaving Emily gasping, her lungs burning as she clutched her clothes to her chest. The silence grew so loud it began to scream, a silent, invisible frequency that threatened to shatter the very glass in the windows. Emily stood frozen, her bare feet pressing into the cold, rough fibers of the carpet, unable to look away from the predatory darkness in those eyes. She watched as a single, crystalline bead of moisture formed in the corner of Mrs. Blackwood's eye, not a tear of sorrow, but a lubrication of effort, reflecting the dim lamplight like a jagged spark. The heavy, sandpaper rasp of the woman's breathing seemed to hitch for a fraction of a second, a stutter in the mechanical rhythm that suggested a surge of adrenaline, a flicker of a heart rate accelerating in a body that should have been incapable of excitement. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the ceiling descending, until the entire universe consisted only of Emily and the black, hungry voids watching her from the pillow. Finally, with a desperate, jerky motion, Emily threw her nightgown over her head, the fabric muffling the world for a blessed, terrifying second. When she emerged from the folds of the cloth, her face flushed and her eyes stinging with unshed tears, she saw that the pupils had contracted slightly, though the amber gaze remained fixed and unwavering. She retreated to her small cot in the corner, her movements frantic and clumsy, and pulled the thin blanket up to her chin, seeking a sanctuary that the house would not provide. She lay there in the dark, her ears ringing with the sound of her own blood rushing through her veins, listening to the rhythmic, scraping breath of the woman in the bed. It was a sound that told her, with every agonizing rise and fall, that she was no longer alone in the dark, and that the thing in the bed was no longer merely waiting for death, but was actively reaching out for something else entirely. By the morning of the 26th of September, the house on Oak Ridge had begun to contract around Emily like a tightening throat. The transition into the second week was marked not by a change in the weather, but by a subtle shift in the house's acoustic signature, as if the very architecture had finally decided to speak. It started in the quietest hours, shortly after the grandfather clock in the foyer struck 2, its heavy brass pendulum swinging with a slow, metallic grind. As Emily lay on her narrow cot, her ears began to pick up a sound that defied the natural settling of old timber, a frantic, chitinous scratching that seemed to originate from deep within the lath and plaster of the walls. It was a dry, frantic sound, like thousands of tiny, calcified legs scuttling behind the wallpaper, or jagged mandibles rhythmically gnawing at the ancient, dry-rotted studs. Emily pressed her palms against the cold, damp surface of the wall, and for a moment, she could feel a faint vibration, a repulsive shudder that traveled through the floral patterns of the paper and into her fingertips. She tried to convince herself it was merely the industry of long-established vermin, the rats or squirrels that claimed the hollow spaces of such Victorian ruins, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too synchronized. The scratching would start in the corner near the ceiling, a sharp, needle-like rasping, before cascading down toward the floorboards in a wave of frantic activity. It sounded as though the house were hollowed out, filled with a teeming, restless life that was desperately trying to claw its way through the barrier and into the room where she slept. Her physical state began to mirror the deterioration of the environment, her nerves frayed into thin, vibrating wires that hummed with a constant, low-level dread. She found herself staring at the dark circles under her eyes in the spotted bathroom mirror, her skin taking on a waxy, translucent quality that reminded her uncomfortably of the woman in the iron bed. Her hands had developed a fine, persistent tremor that made the simple task of preparing Mrs. Blackwood's medication an agonizing ordeal of clinking glass and spilled drops. The scent of the house had also deepened, the previous smell of dust and antiseptic now underscored by a sharp, acidic tang, like the smell of a hive or a nest that had been disturbed after a century of silence. The sense of being watched had evolved from a psychological discomfort into a physical weight that pressed against her chest, making every breath feel like an act of labor. Even when she stood with her back turned, or when the heavy silk sleep mask was pulled over Mrs. Blackwood's face, Emily felt the amber gaze piercing through the obstacles. The old woman's eyelids were so thin, so stretched across the globes of her eyes, that the golden irises seemed to glow through the skin like embers through parchment. It was a constant, unblinking observation that followed Emily as she scrubbed the floors or organized the medical supplies, a silent, judgmental presence that seemed to record every heartbeat and every stumble. On the afternoon of the 28th of September, while Emily was performing the delicate task of checking the intravenous line, the silence of the room was shattered by a sound that made her drop the plastic tubing. It came from deep within Mrs. Blackwood's throat, a sound that began as a low, wet vibration and escalated into a rhythmic, guttural cloaking. It was a sound of fluid shifting in a hollow space, a subterranean gurgle that possessed the cadence of a frantic, mocking laugh. It didn't sound human, it sounded like water being forced through a cracked pipe, or the wet, slapping sound of a shovel hitting mud. The vibration was so strong that Emily could see the thin, corded muscles in the old woman's neck jumping and twitching beneath the skin. Emily froze, her breath caught in a jagged lump in her throat, her eyes fixed on the woman's mouth, which remained a grim, frozen line of grayish flesh. There was no movement of the lips, no expulsion of air from the lungs that suggested speech, yet the laughter continued, rising in pitch until it sounded like the screeching of a rusted hinge. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malice, a sound that seemed to mock Emily's frantic attempts at care and her growing terror. The air in the room suddenly felt thick with the smell of old copper and stagnant saliva, a humid cloud that settled over Emily's face like a damp shroud. When the sound finally subsided, dying out into a series of wet, clicking pops, the silence that followed was even more terrifying, heavy with the implication that something had just been shared, a secret that Emily was not yet meant to understand. That night, the moon rose as a pale, bloated orb, casting long, surgical blades of gray light through the gaps in the heavy velvet curtains. The light didn't illuminate the room so much as it carved it into sharp, unnatural angles, turning the furniture into jagged silhouettes that seemed to shift whenever Emily blinked. She lay on her cot, her eyes wide and stinging, staring at the ceiling where the gray light caught the drifting motes of dust, making the air look like it was filled with tiny, floating shards of glass. The house was unnaturally still, the scratching in the walls having ceased, leaving only the sound of her own blood rushing through her ears like the roar of a distant ocean. The first slap was so soft that she almost dismissed it as the sound of her own heart skipping a beat. It was a dull, fleshy sound, a palm striking a firm, fabric-covered surface. Thud. Emily's body went rigid, her fingers clenching the edges of her blanket until her nails bit into her palms. She held her breath, listening so intensely that the silence began to ring with a high-pitched, electric frequency. 10 seconds passed, measured by the frantic ticking of the clock in the hall. Then, it happened again. Thud-schlick. A second slap, followed by the sound of skin sliding briefly against the heavy linen of the mattress. It was a deliberate sound, the sound of a hand testing its own weight, or perhaps signaling for attention in the dark. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs with such violence that she feared it would shatter them. Her mind raced through a dozen rationalizations, the house settling, a stray breeze, a dream, but her body knew the truth. The sound had come from the center of the room, from the high, iron bed. A third slap followed, louder this time, the sound of a wet, heavy impact that echoed in the corners of the chamber. Thud. It was a rhythmic summons, a primitive communication that cut through the paralysis of the night. Emily felt a bead of cold sweat roll down her temple, tracing a slow, icy path to her jawline as she realized she could no longer hear the rasping, sandpaper breath of the old woman. Driven by a panicked, reflexive need to see, Emily reached out a shaking hand and fumbled for the switch of the bedside lamp. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal, knocking over a glass of water that shattered on the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Finally, her thumb found the plastic toggle and clicked it downward. The small, yellow bulb flickered to life, casting a sickly, jaundiced glow that struggled against the oppressive gray shadows of the moon. The light was weak, but it was enough to reveal the bed, and what Emily saw there caused a silent scream to catch in her constricted throat, her jaw locking in a spasm of pure, primal horror. Mrs. Blackwood lay exactly as she had for the past 2 weeks, her withered body tucked tightly beneath the pale linens, her skeletal arms resting atop the covers. Her hands were motionless, the long, translucent fingers curved like the talons of a dead bird, showing no sign of having moved an inch. There was no explanation for the slaps, no evidence of physical exertion. Yet, above the frozen mask of her face, her amber eyes were no longer fixed on Emily. They were spinning. The golden irises were whirring in their sockets with a frantic, mechanical speed, rotating in dizzying, opposite circles like twin gears in a haywire machine. They moved with a wet, squelching sound, a frenzied oscillation that reflected the light of the lamp in a series of staccato, golden flashes. The eyes spun so fast that the pupils became blurred streaks of black, a frantic, centrifugal motion that seemed to be trying to pull the very soul of the woman out through the orbits. Emily could hear the tiny, anatomical clicks of the muscles straining, the sound of the optic nerves twisting and snapping in the frantic dance. As she watched, frozen in the yellow light, a thin, dark line of blood began to seep from the corner of the left eye, tracing a jagged path down the parchment skin of the cheek. The eyes did not slow, they did not stop, they continued their mad, silent revolution, a terrifying display of a life force that had been compressed and distorted until it had become something altogether monstrous. Emily's hand remained on the lamp switch, her knuckles white, as she realized that the trap was no longer being set, it had already been sprung, and the whirring of those golden eyes was the sound of the mechanism reaching its terminal velocity. The 29th of September dawned not with light, but with a thickening of the shadows that seemed to seep directly out of the floorboards. When Emily attempted to rise from her cot, she found her limbs heavy and unresponsive, as if the marrow in her bones had been replaced with cold, setting lead. Every movement required a conscious, agonizing exertion of will, a mental command that traveled slowly through a nervous system that felt increasingly alien and fraying. When she finally swung her legs over the side of the bed, the contact of her feet with the floor didn't feel like skin meeting carpet, it felt like a distant impact transmitted through layers of damp wool. Her coordination had dissolved into a stuttering, jerky sequence of failures, turning the simple act of standing into a precarious battle against a gravity that seemed to have doubled in its intensity. As she navigated the short distance to the wash basin, she felt as though she were wading through a waist-deep pool of black, viscous tar. The air offered a physical resistance that made her skin prickle with a cold, numbing heat, and her fingers fumbled uselessly with the ceramic pitcher. The sound of her own breathing was muffled, as if her head were submerged in stagnant water, and the very walls of the hallway appeared to shimmer and warp in the periphery of her vision. Each step was a measured, terrifying risk, her knees buckling and snapping back into place with a dry, clicking sound that echoed the structural groans of the house itself. She was a stranger inhabiting a failing machine, watching through a fog as her hands moved with a disturbing, autonomous delay. By noon, the atmospheric shift in the house had manifested as a suffocating, olfactory assault that no amount of scrubbing could erase. The previous scent of dust and old paper had been violently supplanted by a cloying, pricking aroma that sat heavy on the back of Emily's tongue. It was the smell of 1,000 white lilies left to liquefy in a sealed room, a sweet, putrescent rot that suggested the very foundations of the building were decomposing. Beneath this floral decay was a sharper, more visceral odor, the acrid, singed scent of burnt wool or scorched hair. It clung to the fabrics of her clothes and nested in the follicles of her own hair, a persistent reminder of something organic being consumed by a slow, invisible fire. Emily attempted to wash the floors in the foyer, but the water in her bucket seemed to darken almost instantly, turning a bruised, murky purple that smelled of iron and stagnant rain. As she pushed the mop, her movements were so uncoordinated that the wooden handle clattered against the baseboards with a rhythmic, hollow thud. The sound didn't dissipate, it lingered in the stagnant air, vibrating through the soles of her feet and into her jaw. She found herself leaning against the damp wallpaper, her chest heaving as she tried to draw in the thick, lilac-scented rot that now served as oxygen. The silence of the house was no longer empty, it was filled with a low-frequency pressure that made her inner ear throb with a dull, persistent ache. This pressure gradually coalesced into a sound, a persistent, rhythmic hum that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath the cellar. It was a monochromatic drone, a sound so low it was felt in the diaphragm rather than heard by the ears, like the vibration of a massive, distant engine. As Emily sat on the kitchen floor, unable to muster the strength to stand, the hum began to resolve into something far more articulate and terrifying. It possessed a cadence, a rising and falling of pitch that mimicked the structure of human speech. It sounded like a choir of 1,000 voices trapped behind a wall of thick glass, chanting a monotonous, repetitive litany in a language that predated the invention of the throat. She pressed her ear against the cold, grease-stained linoleum of the kitchen floor, and the sound intensified, becoming a frantic, sibilant whispering that traveled through the joists and the pipes. The chanting was cold and mechanical, a sequence of guttural stops and long, whistling vowels that made the teeth in her head vibrate in their sockets. It wasn't coming from the neighbors or the wind, it was coming from the hollow voids within the house, a secret conversation between the stones and the timber. Emily clutched her head, her fingers digging into her scalp as she tried to drown out the sound, but the chanting seemed to be originating from within her own skull, a parasitic resonance that was slowly overriding her own thoughts. Evening descended with a sudden, violent finality, the gray light outside turning into a bruised, impenetrable black that pressed against the windowpanes like a physical weight. Emily retreated to the bedroom, her body dragging across the floor with a dry, shushing sound that reminded her of a snake moving through dead leaves. The air in the room was now so thick with the smell of burnt hair and rotting lilies that she had to breathe through a damp cloth, her eyes watering from the chemical sting of the atmosphere. The single lamp on the nightstand flickered and hummed, casting long, jittery shadows that danced across the ceiling like the legs of a gargantuan insect. In the center of this sensory cacophony sat the bed, an island of frozen, terrifying stillness. Emily moved toward the wardrobe to begin her nightly change of clothes, but her hands were so numb they felt like wooden blocks. She fumbled with the hem of her sweater, the fabric catching on her skin with a sound like sandpaper on silk. The chanting from the floorboards had reached a fever pitch, a deafening, invisible roar that seemed to be vibrating the very marrow of her teeth. She felt the familiar, hot itch of a gaze on her back, but this time the sensation was different, it was heavier, more invasive, like the cold edge of a knife being drawn slowly down her spine. Risking a glance over her shoulder, Emily finally looked directly into the face of Mrs. Blackwood. The amber glow that had previously defined the woman's eyes was gone, extinguished as if by a sudden, internal vacuum. In its place were two perfect, bottomless abysses, the pupils had expanded until they consumed the irises and the whites entirely, leaving only two twin voids of absolute, light-devouring black. They were not eyes anymore, they were holes in the fabric of reality, reflecting nothing, showing only a depthless, oily darkness that seemed to pull at Emily's very consciousness. The blackness was not static, it appeared to swirl with a slow, hypnotic motion, like ink dropped into a pool of mercury. The old woman's face was no longer a mask of paralysis, the features had sharpened, the skin stretching so tight over the cheekbones that the bones seemed ready to burst through the translucent parchment. The jaw, which had remained locked for weeks, had dropped slightly, revealing a dark, cavernous mouth that looked like the entrance to a tomb. There was no moisture in those eyes, no flicker of human emotion, only the vast, cold emptiness of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Emily felt the air in her lungs turn to ice, her heart slowing until each beat was a singular, painful event that echoed in the silence of the room. Outside, the wind began to rise, not as a gust, but as a sudden, mournful howl that tore through the trees and rattled the heavy oak frames of the windows. The sound was high and shrieking, a chorus of atmospheric agony that seemed to be responding to the darkness in the room. As the wind reached its crescendo, hitting the house with a force that made the floorboards beneath Emily's feet shiver and groan, she noticed a change in the rhythmic breathing from the bed. The sandpaper rasp had stopped, replaced by a profound, expectant silence that felt more terrifying than any sound. The house held its breath, the chanting from the floorboards reaching a singular, piercing note of static. Then, coinciding perfectly with the loudest shriek of the wind, Mrs. Blackwood's chest heaved upward in a sudden, violent spasm. A sharp, jagged exhale tore from her throat, a sound that carried the texture of breaking glass and dry, crushing stone. It wasn't a breath, it was a vocalization, a word forced out through a throat that hadn't seen use in years. The sound was cold and metallic, consisting entirely of harsh, clicking consonants that felt like needles being driven into Emily's ears. It was a word that felt heavy and ancient, a linguistic relic that carried the weight of 1,000 years of rotten silence. The word hung in the air, vibrating against the wallpaper and shimmering in the yellow light of the lamp. It didn't dissipate, it lingered like a physical object, a jagged shard of sound that seemed to slice through the sweet smell of the lilies. As the sound died away, the wind outside fell into a sudden, unnatural calm, leaving the house in a silence so profound it felt like a deafening roar. Emily stood frozen, her hands clutching her half-removed sweater, her eyes locked with the black voids in the bed. She realized then that the word hadn't been a greeting or a plea, it had been a command, a final linguistic key that had just turned the last lock in a door she had never even known existed. The sensation of her body being an intruder intensified, the numbness in her limbs turning into a terrifying, total paralysis that started at her toes and raced upward toward her heart. She could hear the wet, anatomical sound of her own heartbeat slowing, the rhythm becoming identical to the chanting she had heard beneath the floor. The smell of burnt wool was now overwhelming, a thick, greasy smoke that filled her vision and coated her lungs. She tried to blink, but her eyelids were heavy and slow, moving with the same dragging, mechanical delay as the eyes of the woman in the bed. The black holes in the pillow seemed to grow larger, expanding until they filled the entire room, swallowing the lamp, the wardrobe, and the very air itself. In those final seconds of the 29th of September, Emily realized that the hum in her ears was no longer a sound from the floorboards, it was the sound of her own soul being untethered, drifting like a piece of dry silk in a dark, hulling vacuum. She saw the room begin to tilt, the perspective warping until she was looking at the ceiling from a new, lower angle, an angle she recognized with a jolt of primal, crystalline horror. The weight of the years, the rot of the lilies, and the cold, clicking word all converged into a single point of absolute darkness. The transition had begun, and as the final flicker of the lamp died out, she felt herself falling, not into sleep, but into the hollowed-out, calcified shell of a life that was no longer her own. Midnight on the 30th of September did not arrive with a clean edge, not with a bell tolling or a decisive turn of the house toward sleep. It seeped into the bedroom the way damp seeps into plaster, quietly, insistently, until the air carried a new density. Emily surfaced from unconsciousness as if rising through black water, her awareness breaking the surface first while the rest of her remained sunk. Her eyes opened to a darkness so complete it had texture, a velvety thickness that pressed against her lashes. The room smelled of rotting lilies and scorched hair, and underneath that, the familiar medicinal smear of petroleum jelly that clung to everything like a second skin. She tried to move, and nothing answered. No reflex, no twitch, not even the microscopic shift of a fingertip searching for the seam of a blanket. Her body lay arranged exactly as it had fallen, a heavy, sealed shape, and the stillness was so total it became an additional weight on her chest. The sheets beneath her back registered with brutal clarity, each thread and knot translated into sensation, they scraped like sandpaper against the damp film of sweat on her skin. Where the fabric touched the curve of her shoulder blades it felt abrasive, as if ground grit had been sewn into the weave. Even the pressure of the mattress under her spine seemed sharpened, every spring a rigid line insisting on her helplessness. The first sound to anchor her in the room was the wall clock. Its tick was not a polite measuring of time but a thin, metallic incision made into the silence, each second delivered with the clinical precision of a blade. Somewhere beyond her line of sight the pendulum swung, and the faint scrape of its mechanism turned into a slow, hammering rhythm inside her skull. The noise did not remain in the air, it traveled through bone, through teeth, through the tender places behind the eyes. Between ticks there was no relief, only a ringing absence that stretched and then snapped again with the next beat. Time did not pass, it struck. Her breath, when she listened for it, was already wrong. It came in shallow pulls that snagged on the thickness of the air, as if the room offered resistance to being inhaled. The exhale did not empty her, it merely loosened the tightness for an instant before the next small gulp. In her throat, her heartbeat had climbed upward, no longer a steady presence in the chest but a frantic flutter lodged too high, beating against tissue that was never meant to be a cage. The sound of it was not a thump but a rapid, papery buffeting, like wings colliding with wire, like a trapped bird striking the same bars over and over until the air itself vibrated. Her eyes adjusted in slow increments, finding shapes by their absence rather than their form. The ceiling above was an indistinct void, and the corners of the room gathered darkness in heavier pools where the walls met, as if the architecture collected shadow and stored it. The iron bed frame, normally a black geometry against dim light, was swallowed, only a suggestion of its height remained, a vertical presence near her peripheral vision. The curtains were somewhere beyond the bed, but the moonlight that had once carved the room into blades was gone, replaced by a flat, suffocating black. She could not tell whether her eyes were open wide or half-lidded. The paralysis had stolen the ability to measure her own face. A pressure in the room announced itself before any movement did. It was not a sound, not yet, but a subtle alteration in the air, a sense of mass displacing silence. The hair at her nape prickled as if a cold current had slid beneath it, and the skin along her forearms tightened with gooseflesh she could not see. The smell of burnt wool thickened, becoming greasy and intimate, as though something had stepped closer to the source. The air near her mouth tasted faintly of metal, an old copper tang that coated her tongue without the comfort of saliva. The room, already small, seemed to contract around a new center of gravity. From the corner nearest the wardrobe, the darkness shifted. It did not leap or lunge, it separated itself with the slow decisiveness of a curtain being drawn. A shape became distinct only by the way it blotted out what little depth the blackness had, a deeper black moving against a black background. The change was so incremental her mind tried to smooth it into stillness, to insist nothing had moved at all. But the clock kept cutting seconds into the air, and with each cut, the shape advanced by a fraction. The house did not creak in protest the way it often did, it seemed to hold its breath, eager not to interrupt. Then the first footfall landed on the parquet. The sound was unmistakably bare skin against old wood, a soft, blunt contact followed by a faint drag, as if toes had flexed and released. The floorboard answered with a small, exhausted complaint, a dry squeal buried under the heavier creak. The noise traveled across the room like a fingertip across a taut membrane, both delicate and obscene in its intimacy. The next step came after a pause measured in 2 ticks of the clock, and it arrived with the same cadence, the same confident placement. It was not the hesitant shuffle of someone navigating darkness, it was the steady approach of something that knew the room better than she did, something that did not need to see to move. Emily's throat tried to shape sound. A pressure built behind her sternum, the automatic bodily preparation for a scream that required no planning. The muscles in her chest tightened, her ribs straining outward, and the air rushed toward her vocal cords. Nothing emerged. Her voice was not merely absent, it was unreachable, as though the pathway between intention and vibration had been cut and cauterized. The attempt left a burning ache in her throat, a silent spasm that sent a sour taste up into her mouth. The failure made her breathing more frantic, shallow gasps scraping her dry airway, each inhale too small to satisfy the body's demand for panic. The steps continued, evenly spaced, each one striking the same tempo as the clock's pendulum but with a heavier, more human certainty. Wood groaned beneath the soles, a slow complaint that rose and then sank, but the walker did not adjust. With each footfall the smell of lilies shifted, stirred as if the air were being pushed aside, and the scorched odor gained heat, turning from distant suggestion into something fresh, like hair singeing over a flame. The darkness ahead of her bed thickened into a silhouette that now clearly occupied space, a vertical form with shoulders. The approach was so calm it felt like cruelty, the deliberate refusal to hurry offering her too much time to register every detail she could not alter. Her eyes strained toward the bed, toward the place where Mrs. Blackwood had been for days, an altar of iron and linen. In the dark, the bed was a mass that absorbed everything, but her mind filled it with remembered shapes, the high frame, the layered sheets, the parchment skin. The rasping breath that had dominated the room for so long was absent now, and that absence was its own sound, a blankness so complete it rang. The tick of the clock, the minute creak of wood, her own stuttering breaths, these floated in the void where the old woman's respiration should have been. The room felt rearranged, as if the furniture had shifted while she slept, but it was only the shift in roles. She lay immobilized, and the room moved around her. A new sound threaded itself through the rhythm, quieter than footsteps, more intimate. It was the soft wetness of saliva collecting, a subtle click at the back of a throat that was not hers. It happened between ticks, in the brief pockets of silence, and it made the darkness feel close enough to touch. The smell of petroleum jelly grew sharper, warmed by proximity, and the medicinal tang of menthol rose in the air as if someone had opened a jar beside her pillow. The air near her face was no longer neutral, it carried the faint heat of a body, a living warmth that had no business in that room at that hour. Her skin responded with a cold sweat that spread slowly along her ribs and lower back, a slickness trapped against the abrasive sheets. The shadow reached the side of her bed. The floorboard there gave a long, drawn-out groan, the timber flexing under weight, and the sound stretched in time like a low animal noise. The steps stopped. The sudden absence of movement made the room tilt, as if her mind had been following the cadence and now had nothing to hold. The clock continued, indifferent, slicing seconds with the same thin precision, but the presence beside her bed filled the gaps between ticks with pressure. She could sense the outline without seeing it, a figure standing too close, occupying the space where her personal air should have been. The darkness above her seemed deeper, as if the shadow leaned in and blocked even the faintest ambient black. Her eyes dragged upward as much as they could, the only movement she still possessed, and even that was minimal, a slow shift as though her gaze were caught in syrup. The ceiling remained an indistinct void, but the edge of something entered her field of vision, a darker shape against darkness, a curve that might have been an arm or a shoulder. It hovered near the head of her bed, and the stillness of it was controlled, deliberate. A fine sound came from the figure's skin, a tiny creak of tendon, a faint crackle like knuckles flexing somewhere in the dark. It was the quiet noise of a body that was not failing, a body that could afford to be patient. Emily's heartbeat battered her throat harder, turning each pulse into a choking sensation. The skin at her collarbone grew slick with sweat, and the dampness chilled quickly in the stagnant air. Her stomach clenched in slow waves, nausea rising and falling with the rhythm of the clock, each tick seeming to push it higher. Somewhere in the house a pipe made a distant, settling pop, and the sound traveled through the walls like a bone snapping far away. The wardrobe remained a hulking black rectangle at the edge of the room, and the corner it cast was now empty, its darkness redistributed into the standing figure. The room had become a stage with a single actor she could not see. The presence shifted its weight. The parquet answered again, a deeper creak, the wood complaining under a different angle of pressure. The sound came with a faint, leathery friction, skin sliding minutely against skin, as if the figure's toes had gripped the floor for stability. Emily's awareness narrowed to that small noise, that subtle confirmation of physicality. Something alive stood over her, something with bare feet, something that occupied the world with joints and weight. The smell of it was not the stale odor of decay, it carried a faint clean note beneath the rot, the warm mineral scent of living skin. The contrast made her throat tighten more, her breathing turning into quick, thin sips that barely moved her chest. The clock's pendulum seemed louder, as if the walls reflected it back with added force. Tick. The sound landed in her skull with a blunt impact. Tick. Another blow. The rhythm fused with her heart's frantic flutter until it was impossible to tell which beat belonged to which system. The room's darkness pressed against her eyes, but the presence above her was close enough that she could sense subtle changes in the air, the way warmth rose and then settled. A faint draft moved across her lips, not from a window but from the displacement of air near her face. It was the precursor to breath, the intake before a sound. Her lungs tried to draw deeper, to fill, but the paralysis held her chest in an uncooperative stiffness. Panic forced itself into her bloodstream anyway, flooding her with cold heat. The fine hairs inside her nose caught the smell of lilies in their most corrupted phase, sweet and putrid at once, and the burnt wool note deepened into something like scorched fat. Her tongue felt too large in her mouth, a useless muscle trapped behind teeth she could not unclench. She tried again to force sound, a desperate internal command that crashed against immovable flesh. The result was only a faint tremor in her throat, a silent convulsion that left her eyes watering in the dark. The shadow leaned closer to the head of the bed, and the air changed again, warmer and more humid. Emily's skin registered it with the sensitivity of a bruise, the warmth did not comfort, it invaded. A faint scent threaded through the rot, unexpectedly clean, like soap on newly washed hands, and it made her stomach twist harder. The juxtaposition was obscene, life-perfumed and polished standing in a room that had been steeped in antiseptic and decay. The presence hovered at the boundary of her vision, close enough that she could almost feel the disturbance of its clothing, if it wore any, against the air. The silence around it was not empty, it was packed tight, compressed by intention. A sound began in the darkness above her pillow. At first it was only the softest movement of air, a barely audible drawing inward that made the hair along Emily's temples stir. It deepened immediately, expanding as the lungs behind it opened fully, and the room seemed to respond by yielding. The inhale was long and unbroken, a steady pull that did not hitch or rasp, not the mechanical sandpaper respiration she had lived beside for days. It had volume and ease, the sound of a healthy chest widening without pain. It carried a faint resonance, as if the breath filled not just lungs but the room itself, as if it wanted to occupy every corner. The air flowed past teeth and tongue in a smooth channel, and in its wake came a subtle wet click as the throat adjusted, readying itself for speech that did not arrive. The inhale continued, impossibly deep, drawing the room's stench into a body that welcomed it. Emily heard the minute shifting of fabric somewhere near the figure's ribs, the tiny stretch of skin over muscle. The sound of that breath was almost beautiful in its completeness, and that was what made it unbearable. It was a declaration without words, a proof of vitality standing in the dark above her. The air near her face cooled slightly as the figure drew it in, a gentle suction that made the hairs on her upper lip lift. The clock ticked on, each second a hard punctuation against the continuous, smooth pull of that inhalation. When the breath finally reached its fullest point, there was a pause. It was a held moment, an absolute stillness where the house seemed to hover. The pendulum ticked, the wood settled, the distant pipes stayed quiet, and even Emily's frantic heart stuttered as if startled by the suspension. The pause was not hesitation, it was possession, the deliberate savoring of having lungs that could hold air. In that small interval, Emily's senses sharpened painfully, the grit of the sheets, the salt of sweat at her hairline, the faint metallic taste at the back of her throat. The presence above her remained close, a dark mass warmed from within, and the room seemed to orbit it. The exhale did not come immediately. Instead the figure shifted minutely, and the bed's frame answered with a soft, iron complaint as if the air itself had weight. Emily could hear the faint creak of tendons again, the subtle internal noises of a body aligning itself. The smell of soap and living skin strengthened, mixing with lilies and burnt wool into something nauseatingly complex. The proximity made the darkness feel thick enough to drown in. Emily's breath kept scraping in short pulls, each one too small, each one a reminder that her lungs could not match the depth of the presence looming above her. The exhale arrived at last, slow and controlled, releasing air with a faint warmth that brushed her forehead. It was not a sigh of relief, it was the measured outflow of someone savoring their own capacity. The sound carried a quiet satisfaction, a smoothness that made the skin on Emily's arms prickle despite her immobility. The released air spread the scent of scorched hair outward, as if the exhale stirred it from some hidden source. The clock's tick seemed to retreat for an instant, reduced to a background detail against the intimate dominance of that breath. Emily's body remained locked, but her mind raced in tight circles around the only certainty offered. Something young and strong stood at her head, breathing like it had waited a very long time to do so. The figure remained there, not touching, not speaking, occupying the space with patient weight. The darkness did not lift to reveal features, it only deepened around the presence, as though the room granted it privacy. The abrasive sheets continued to scratch at Emily's skin with every involuntary expansion of her shallow breaths. The pendulum kept striking seconds into her skull, relentless and loud, but the memory of that inhale eclipsed everything, a sound too full of life to belong in that house. In the long, wet silence that followed, the air tasted of lilies and smoke, and the room waited, poised around the bed like a closed fist. Moonlight returned the way memory returns in fever, sudden, unwelcome, and too sharp at the edges. A cloud's slow drift unsealed the sky, and a thin, diluted silver spilled through the gaps in the heavy curtains, finding the room in narrow bands. The light did not brighten so much as outline, tracing the iron bed frame with a cold gleam and picking pale highlights from the wardrobe's polished face. Dust motes hung in the beam like suspended ash, barely moving in the thick air. In that slanted illumination, the standing shadow at the head of the bed acquired contours, and the pressure of its presence gained a body. It was a young woman, close enough that the moon outlined the arc of her cheek and the fall of her hair. The hair was long and dark, loose over her shoulders in a heavy curtain that drank in light and returned it in soft, oily glints. The figure's posture was impossible to misread, upright, shoulders back, spine straight with an ease that suggested strength rather than tension. Bare feet planted on the parquet, toes relaxed, the stance had the quiet confidence of a body that trusted itself. The air around her carried a warmth that made the moonlight feel colder by comparison, a living heat that made Emily's skin prickle under the abrasive sheet. The woman stretched slowly, as though waking from an indulgent sleep rather than standing in a room that stank of lilies decomposing in stagnant water. Her arms rose with unhurried control, elbows unfurling, wrists rotating, fingers flexing as if reacquainting themselves with motion. The movement was smooth and economical, not a flail against stiffness but a deliberate extension meant to savor range. As she stretched, the joints answered with small, clean cracks, soft pops that sounded almost pleasant, like knuckles loosening after a long day, like a spine aligning into comfort. Each sound landed in the room with unsettling clarity, magnified by the surrounding silence, and each one was a reminder of cartilage and tendon doing their simple, healthy work. In the brief flare of moonlight, Emily recognized details with the brutal immediacy of familiarity. The shape of the hands, slender, strong, nails short and practical, was the shape she had seen holding a sponge, a pill bottle, a tray. The angle of the forearm as it lifted was the angle she had watched in mirror reflections while fastening buttons and tying hair back. When the woman's head tilted, the line of the neck and jaw caught the light, and it matched the line Emily had traced absent-mindedly in the bathroom mirror, the profile she had never thought to fear. Recognition did not bring relief, it turned her stomach into a hard knot, because recognition had nowhere to go in a body that would not move. The wardrobe mirror, dull with age and faint streaks, became a window for an instant. The moon's narrow beam struck its surface and returned a ghost of an image, the young woman's reflected profile, partial and warped by old glass. Dark hair, high cheekbone, familiar brow, the curve of lips in repose, Emily's own face, rearranged by a calm that did not belong to her. The reflection wavered with the slightest vibration of the house, making the image seem like a creature behind water, but it remained unmistakable. The sight did not feel like looking at herself, it felt like being shown the theft, the evidence displayed without urgency because it was already complete. The young woman lowered her arms and let them fall at her sides with a soft, controlled weight. Her chest rose and fell, steady and deep, the breath that had filled the dark now visible in the faint movement of collarbones and the subtle expansion of ribs. She turned her head slightly, and moonlight traced the outer edge of an eye, catching a wet shine at the corner. That eye shifted downward. The movement was slow enough to count in ticks of the wall clock, deliberate enough to feel ceremonial, as though the act of looking were a gesture of ownership. Emily tried to lift her gaze to meet it and discovered how little control remained. The effort did not travel through her body, it stalled somewhere behind her eyes like a command shouted down a sealed hallway. Her pupils dragged a fraction to the side, a small, scraping shift, and the change in perspective hit with disorienting force. The ceiling no longer seemed above her cot, it felt higher, farther away, as if she lay deeper in the room than she had before. The edges of the bed frame cut the darkness at a different angle, and the air around her seemed to press in from a lower vantage, like looking out from a pit. The realization arrived not as a thought but as a sensory rupture. The mattress beneath her back did not feel like her thin cot's familiar sag, it felt firmer, higher, and the sheets touching her skin were not the rough cotton she had slept on. Her body did not register the mattress as soft support, it registered it as a platform under a body that had grown too light, too bony, too dry. The smell closest to her was not her own sweat and detergent, it was rotten old petroleum jelly, thick and greasy, embedded in skin that could not wash it off. The room's air tasted different from this height, as if the lower layer held more decay, more dust, more medicinal residue. She became aware of her skin with an awful clarity. It did not feel supple over muscle, it felt stretched, too tight, as if drawn across a frame that no longer filled it. Where the fabric touched her forearm, sensation was both dull and sharp, dull in its slow arrival, sharp in its texture, as if nerves had thinned along with everything else. The skin itself felt dry, papery, and fragile, like old cardboard that had been kept too near heat, stiffened and ready to crack. Beneath it, bone pressed close to the surface in angles that did not belong to a young body, and the pressure points against the mattress seemed to grind, as if the flesh between bone and fabric had become an afterthought. A sound joined the clock's ticking, and it was coming from her. It was not the shallow, panicked breathing from moments before, it was a rasp, a wet, whistling draw that scraped through the throat with effort. The inhale rattled as though passing through something narrow and compromised, and the exhale left behind a faint hiss that lingered in the air. It carried the texture of sandpaper against dry wood, the mechanical insistence of lungs that did not flex cleanly. Hearing it from within, feeling it originate in a chest that no longer rose with ease, made the room tilt again, as if gravity had changed rules while she slept. Above her, the young woman shifted her weight and stepped away from the bed. Bare feet crossed the parquet with a confidence that made the floorboards complain in long, familiar groans. The sound of her steps was different now that moonlight revealed the source, not a creeping approach but the casual, unhurried movement of someone alone in her own home. Each footfall landed with a soft slap and a tiny, satisfying roll of weight from heel to toe. The house responded with its old noises, wood flexing, nails whispering, the faint murmur of settling plaster, but none of it slowed her. She walked toward the wardrobe mirror, and Emily watched from below with the helplessness of a mind stuck behind thick glass. The young woman's body moved with a flexible strength, shoulders loose, spine aligned, hips steady. Moonlight traced the curve of her calf as she stepped into the beam, then slid away as she left it, making her appear and disappear in fragments. In the dim, her skin looked alive in a way the room did not, holding warmth rather than reflecting cold. The smell of her, a clean mineral note beneath the house's rot, followed her like a wake, stirring the stagnant air. She stopped before the mirror and lifted one hand toward her face. The gesture was intimate, almost tender, fingertips finding cheekbone, sliding to the jaw, then up toward the temple as if confirming the shape. The touch made a soft sound against skin, a faint friction that implied moisture and warmth. In the mirror's warped surface, her face appeared clearer, the moonlight giving it contrast. Emily's eyes, Emily's mouth, Emily's hairline, assembled into a person who wore them without effort. The young woman's expression did not strain, it rested in itself, calm and satisfied, as though inhabiting the face were a privilege being savored. A small sound escaped her, delicate and melodic, the kind of quiet laugh that might belong in a bright kitchen, not in this dark room. It was brief, almost affectionate in its softness, and it sharpened the horror by its normality. The sound carried a lightness that did not match the air's thickness, as if the laugh rejected the room's decay. It hung for a moment, then dissolved into the slow tick of the clock and the faint hum of the house settling into its night. Emily's lungs answered with another rasping inhale that trembled at the end, the throat narrowing around the effort. The young woman turned from the mirror with controlled slowness, and the motion brought the moonlight across her features like a passing blade. Her eyes caught it, and for an instant they gleamed with wetness, reflecting silver. The look she directed toward the bed was not curious, it was appraising, the same predatory focus that had once lived behind amber irises in a withered face. The gaze lingered, steady and unblinking, and something in it felt practiced, ancient beneath the surface of youth. It carried the same humid intensity that had once pressed against Emily's back while she undressed, now housed in eyes that belonged to her own face. Emily's awareness bucked against the limits of her new body, slamming into paralysis again and again like a trapped animal against a cage. The urge to scream gathered in her chest, a pressure that demanded release, but it met a throat that produced only that rasping, whistling breath. The effort tightened the brittle skin along her neck, pulling it against bone, creating a faint ache like paper tearing in slow motion. Her mouth, somewhere in the darkness of her own face, felt slack and unresponsive, lips too dry to shape sound. The scream remained inside, vibrating silently, turning inward until it became nausea, until it became heat behind the eyes that could not blink hard enough to spill tears. The young woman did not approach the bed again. She held the gaze a moment longer, letting it settle like a weight, then shifted her attention away with the casual authority of someone finished with an inspection. She moved toward the door with unhurried steps, and each footfall made the parquet answer in a different register as she crossed varying boards, some higher-pitched creaks, some deeper groans. The rhythm was steady, unafraid, matching the pendulum's relentless tempo without being swallowed by it. The air stirred with her passage, lifting the smell of lilies and burnt wool in slow eddies, then letting it fall back heavier once she passed. As she reached the door, moonlight caught the outline of her shoulder and the fall of her hair one last time, turning them into a silhouette of life against the room's dead darkness. Her hand rose to the brass handle, and metal responded with a faint, dull clink. The handle turned smoothly, as if well oiled, and the movement made a small, decisive sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The door opened just enough to create a thin seam of deeper dark beyond, a corridor that swallowed light and offered none in return. The young woman stepped through without hesitation, her bare foot making a final soft slap on the threshold. The door began to close. The hinges did not shriek, they moved with a slow, practiced ease, as though the house itself guided the wood into place. The narrowing gap erased the last trace of her silhouette, the last hint of clean warmth, leaving only the stale interior air. As the door met the frame, the sound arrived, the same dull, wet finality Emily remembered from her first arrival. It was not a simple latch, it was a moist, heavy click, like soft tissue sealing, like a jaw closing around prey. The noise had an absolute quality, a ceiling of worlds, and it left the room feeling airless, as if that sound had locked not only the door but the oxygen. Silence settled in layers. The clock continued its thin, metallic ticking, but it now seemed far away, muffled by the density of the room. The moonlight shifted again as clouds moved, and the beam on the wardrobe mirror faded, leaving only dull darkness and the faintest sheen of old glass. Dust motes disappeared into black, and the bed frame became a suggestion rather than a shape. The house held its breath for a long moment, and in that held space, Emily's new breathing was the only living sound. It rasped and hissed, wet at the back of the throat, each inhale a struggle that scraped along narrowed passages. The exhale whistled, thin and prolonged, as if air were being forced through a small crack in old wood. The sound filled the room with a sick rhythm, replacing the absence that had once been Mrs. Blackwood's mechanical respiration. It came with the smell of decay rising from her own skin, the greasy sweetness of petroleum jelly trapped in pores, the sour undertone of something organic failing slowly. The sheets against her felt rougher now, the scratch of fabric against brittle skin a constant reminder that she could not shift away from discomfort. Time resumed its cruel steadiness. The pendulum's ticks continued to land like small blows, measuring seconds she could not spend. The room remained closed, sealed by that wet click, and the corridor outside offered no footfalls now, no return of warmth, no retreat of the house's rot. Emily lay trapped in a body that belonged to the bed's history, to the smell embedded in the wallpaper, to the stains in the wood. In the dark, her ragged, whistling breath went on, and the house listened to it the way it had listened before, patiently, hungrily, as though waiting for the sound to become normal.